Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with the final part of the future of the vampire counts. I do want to take a quick moment to apologize that this video is out a day later than I originally intended, as on Saturday I accidentally kind of went too ham with recording multiple things and streaming and apparently threw out my voice for a bit. So anyway, moving on. Now that we've completed the FLC section, it's time to move to the ideas that are a bit crazier, and this section focuses on DLC ideas, so things that would either require a notable amount of work or completely new assets. So with that said, let's get going. The first thing I would recommend is that we're essentially going to work our way through the various bloodlines. For those of you who aren't aware, the vampire counts can be split into 5 distinct bloodlines for the actual vampires themselves. So far in the game, the only 2 that we really have strong representation for are the Von Karsteins and the Strigoi Ghouls, which the Strigoi are their own bloodline, but their lords are known as the Strigoi Ghoul Kings. So those 2 are fairly well represented, so that leaves us with 3 to cover. The first I'd like to look at could be interpreted as either a lord or a hero, or even both, the Blood Dragon. For those unaware, the Blood Dragons are the most martially accomplished of the vampires. They are often the most bloodthirsty and ruthless unless they tend to be obsessed with honor, but there's often a narrow ground between the 2. Many Bretonnians and knights have faced Blood Dragons in the field and impressed their opponents enough that they receive the Blood Kiss as a sort of reward, a cursed, backstabbing reward, but reward nonetheless. And thus, many of those honorable individuals become terrible titans, much like the Red Duke himself. They are descended from the Lord Abarash, and here's kind of some ideas for them. The first thing is that I think they should have significantly less of a magical emphasis, because Blood Dragons aren't known for being very good casters. They almost entirely specialize in combat feats. Both Wallach and Luther Harkin were notably not the best casters. Wallach was nothing impressive, and Luther was kind of a gifted magic user, but he did have his brains essentially burned out when he tried to overwhelm an artifact of the Old Ones in Lustria, and it did not go well for him, and he was pretty much left without any ability to use magic. He just sort of pulsed with energy that allowed him to keep raising the dead around him, but he could no longer actively cast. Then of course you have Abarash, the original Blood Dragon and the founder of the line, who, to my knowledge, in many of the books I've read that include him, was not possessing any magical talent. Presumably he had a little bit, because all vampires have a little, but he was really not gifted at all with the magical arts. To represent that, I would think the best thing to do for them would be to either give them half a lore, so give them like the lore of vampires, but they only have half the spells, or I would simply allow them to have a spell tree, so sure, they can get all 6 spells, but they don't have Arcane Conduit and they don't have any other boosts to their magic. There are a couple of characters like that already in the game. I don't remember exactly which ones it is. I think it might be the Loremaster of Hoeth, but I'm not sure. But there are characters who literally just have spells and no other augments, and that should be the case for the Blood Dragons. However, to compensate for this, they should essentially be heavily armored monsters in close combat. A cool thing to do with them also would be to have them probably be the anti-large armor-piercing lord or hero for the vampire counts, either wielding great weapons or lances. Obviously, you could do a lance system with them if you made it so that they could only show up on a horse or bigger, or alternatively, you could just give them great weapons and maybe even have their weapons switch as they get on higher mounts, which we've never really seen before, so I don't expect that, but I would expect a great weapon system with them. It could be sword and board, but since we already have that with the Von Karsteins, I think it'd be better for the Blood Dragons to pull up that line of things. So essentially, that's the long story short for them is bad at casting, but they should have the best combat stats of the different vampire types, if they're heroes or lords. The next one is the Neckcrack line, who are the descendants of Wazoran. Neckcracks are essentially the researchers and experimenters of the vampire count line, and they are also hilariously obsessed with magic and gathering power and knowledge. They're the summon masters next to the master necromancers themselves, and have actually invented some interesting types of undead. The records we have indicate that the Crypt Horrors, Terrorgeist, and all of the spirit units were essentially invented at some point by descendants of the Neckcrack lines. So for the Neckcrack vampire, he could once again either be a hero or lord or both. They should have a huge emphasis on magic and summoning. One thing that I would recommend is giving them a summon ability that doesn't cost magic, so a bound spell, in addition to their spells. So, for instance, instead of having, like, Banishment, that we see with Mazdamundi or Volkmar the Grim or regular Slann, I would recommend instead giving them a free cast to summon a unit of Cairn Wraiths, since that's one of the more notable and famous creatures that they invented. They should have, however, a notably worse melee tree than other vampire counts, but perhaps to replace their melee tree, which I would only make like half a tree, maybe they could have another red tree that's purely dedicated to buffing their minions and just generating insane amounts of magic. It would be very neat, though, to see a lord who, because of their focus in necromancy and summoning, actually has like bound summoning spells as their kind of high-level thing for their casting tree, instead of just another vortex spell. I do want to note, however, they should still be very decent in melee, because they're still vampires, so I would still have them have an equivalent base stat line to other vampire lords or heroes, but they just shouldn't be able to level up to be nearly as good at fighting. Obviously, in multiplayer, you might want to have it where the Neckcracks are worse at fighting than their fellows, but, you know, have better casting abilities. The final bloodline that we're going to be taking a look at are the Lamians, who are the descendants of the first vampire, Neferata. They are much more about intrigue and speed and stealth. That's kind of their sphere of influence. They're very nefarious, and they tend to use enchantments that focus on beguiling opponents, disabling them through various magical and natural means. In any event, the reason that I think the Lamians should be a lord choice only and not a lord or hero or both like I recommended with the Neckcracks and the Blood Dragons is for two primary reasons. One is that the Lamians already are a pretty much exclusively female bloodline. There are a few males, but they are incredibly rare. Pretty much all of them are hunted or completely crazy. And the thing about them is that we already have female vampire heroes, and I think it would be difficult to draw a really interesting line in appearance and functionality between the Vampiress hero and a Vampiress Lamian hero, because the Vampiress hero we have right now is von Karstein. All the vampires we have are von Karstein themed. The second thing, which is much more interesting, is that the Lamians actually have a unique mount, which is my favorite of the vampire count mounts, and it's known as the Coven Throne. So, very similar in structure to the Mortis engine. What makes the Coven Throne unique is that instead of a necromancer firing off dark magic to heal allies and damage foes, it instead has a crew of two lovely pallid handmaidens. Despite their appearance, however, these ladies are terrifying in combat, as they are full-blown vampires of Lamian descent, which means they're lightning fast. In addition, the Coven Throne is so naturally mesmerizing and crewed by such hypnotic beauties that it essentially has a more powerful form of beguile constantly going. Any who try to target the throne either by shooting or combat will find their will under assault, which has penalties ranging from less accurate attacks up to refusing to fire or even attacking their allies instead. In Total War Warhammer, this would best be interpreted as either a passive aura or active ability. As an aura, I would make it a simply 40 to 50 meter debuff that lowers the accuracy and melee attack of enemy units. If it were an active instead, I'd say if it's a large AoE, make the debuff more powerful, and if it's a single target onto a unit, it should be a very powerful debuff and cause damage as they attack one another in their enthrallment. Kind of think like Melkos miasma level of hurt, nothing too crazy. Finally, as we're not done yet, the Coven Throne grants the Scrying Pool ability, as the Vampire Lord can gaze into the large pool of blood before them to glean information about the future. In tabletop, This provided them with a terrifying bonus in close combat when rolling to hit or to wound. So in Total War Warhammer, I'd make it a bound spell with perhaps a limited number of maximum casts that notably increases the Coven Throne's melee attack and weapon strength as the vampiresses tear into their enemies. The only downside to the Coven Throne compared to the Mortis engine is that it doesn't cause terror, regenerate, or drain nearby enemies. However, to compensate, it does have a very high ward save, which, knowing CA, will be made into a physical resist bonus instead of a proper ward save, but it would still be pretty tanky compared to a lot of things in the vampire line, due to likely having a decent melee defense, decent armor, a solid physical or ward save bonus, and of course having the mass and speed very similar to a Mortis engine, which would allow it to push around and just tear into people. I would really, really love to see this mount put into the game, and it's something that really makes the Lamians stand out as something very, very different. Moving forward, for the Master Necromancer and or Neckcrack Vampire, it'd be awesome to see the addition of the Abyssal Terror mount, which for those who don't know is kinda like an undead griffin or manticore. It's basically a bunch of those size creatures stitched together. And this creature was originally called a Winged Nightmare and was a prominent creature in the Vampire Count's army list. It has some neat features. Most of them, the Abyssal Terrors, have poisoned attacks, and the really powerful ones also have notable armor-piercing qualities as they've been enhanced with huge spooky claws that allow them to cut through armor like butter. If the Abyssal Terror was added to the game, especially with his poisoned attacks, I think he'd actually make for a very good mount option, especially for the Master Necromancer, because not only would it give this lord a monstrous unit option, but for the Necrarchs and Master Necromancers who don't have the best combat stats, having a mount that not only allows them to fly and be able to take on lords who are on smaller mounts like Pegasi, but more importantly has poison attacks so it's able to debuff their enemies, would be a really nice combo and could add some really interesting variety and flavor to those caster lords who typically you just never would want to really commit to a fight. Returning to the roster at large, the only thing I can think of that would be easy to add to the vampire counts would be spirit hosts. Just a collection of spooky ghost blobs making a unit that's all about being tanky and defensive. Not able to do much, if any, damage, but excellent at just tying down enemy units thanks to a high health pool and the ethereal ability. And they're not too OP or anything, as they only cause fear like other undead, so they wouldn't be able to run around being an annoying terror bomb like you might see with Hexrace or Cairnrace. For those wondering, the big difference between the spirit hosts and the zombies is that the spirit hosts are much faster, but have less health and rely more on their ethereal ability to lock down enemy units. This makes them better for locking down elite units that would normally plow through zombies so long as there's no magic involved. So for instance, if you're on a battlefield and you see some dragon princes coming for you, you really wouldn't want to necessarily commit a zombie unit to that because the dragon princes would literally just plow right through them without any issue and could just wipe them out in a matter of seconds. However, if a spirit host were to intercept them, the spirit host would not only likely be able to take the charge without allowing them to break through, but could hold them down for a while unless the high elf player buffed them with some sort of magic spell or used magic to destroy the spirit hosts, which would just make them a really good tar pit unit for different situations. For instance, I wouldn't recommend using a spirit host to take on like basic spearmen or Saurus warriors, because they are kind of a more basic infantry and you wouldn't really get your value out of how quickly they could be burned down by those classic common units. But they would be good for holding off Temple Guard, Croxagors, Dark Elf, Col One Riders, things like that. Things that are heavy and expensive and don't necessarily have a lot of models, so they can't just pump out attacks to tear through the spirit hosts even though they have physical resistance. Last, but certainly not least, is my recommended new legendary lord to join the ranks of the undead. Obviously in the DLC section. It should be no secret to most that my favorite vampire in the entire setting is none other than Zacharias the Ever-Living, one of the most powerful vampires in existence. Zacharias long ago was a necromancer that served the infamous Doomlord Dieter Hellschnicht up near Middenheim, but eventually he wandered away from his master and was drawn towards a mysterious tower that radiated with necromantic power. This was Melchior's tower, the most powerful Neckcrack alive, and the one who had tried to destroy the bloodline's founder, Wazorin, but ended up possessed by the fiend for his trouble. Despite the powerful enchantments guarding the tower, Zacharias managed to slip inside, but was caught by the mortal guards and presented to Melchior/Wazorin, who from now on I'm just going to refer to as Melchior, but realize they're the same person. The mighty vampire was impressed by the necromancer's sorcerous power, and thus decided to take him on as an acolyte and gave him the blood kiss. After this, Zacharias studied under Melchior for many years, who due to having Wazorin in his mind was a tad bit insane, and tended to lash out in violent episodes. Zacharias was clever enough to avoid his master during these outbursts, but every day Melchior would eventually calm down and track him, all the while swearing today was the day he died. Yet every night, Zacharias demonstrated some new feat of magical power or knowledge that surprised his master, and thus he was spared for another night. Over the years, Melchior taught his pupil everything he knew, but refused to allow him near his Book of Nagash. In typical Neckcrack, or Sith, fashion, however, Zacharias waited for his master to leave one night on a mad rampage, and slipped into his chambers to study the book for himself. Unfortunately, his master returned quicker than expected and discovered this betrayal. The two engaged in a magical duel, but Melchior proved superior as he had just gorged on blood and possessed many powerful artifacts at his disposal. So Zacharias had no choice but to flee, and barely escaped with his life into the mountains. But he was pursued by his master's agents for a full year, barely finding a cave to rest in before being discovered quickly afterwards. At long last, however, Zacharias stumbled into a large, dark cavern, and found a hidden alcove to rest in for 10 long years. At some point during this time, an ancient and powerful black dragon discovered the cave as well, unaware of the weak vampire lurking within. She made her nest there, and slowly built up a mound of treasure to rest upon. Unfortunately for her, Zacharias finally awoke during one of her own rests, and in his desperate thirst for blood, he immediately latched onto her underbelly like a leech and drank deep. The monster's blood granted him an absurd amount of power, as he discovered the secret antidote to the vampire's curse. Zacharias used his power to make the dragon slumber deeply without waking, and slowly drained her of all her blood over the course of a month. Infused with horrific power, he then raised the dragon to serve as his mount, and set out immediately for Melchior's tower. The second battle between Zacharias on his zombie dragon and Melchior was the stuff of legend, with such insane amounts of magic being unleashed that the enchanted tower was all but obliterated. When the dust cleared, however, it was Zacharias who stood as victor. Thus he plundered the tower, taking all its secrets and magical artifacts, including the Book of Nagash. He now resides in the Forest of Shadows, where all creatures fear his wrath. So with who he is out of the way, let's dive into some of those crazy items he looted off his former master. First up is his weapon, the fearsome Staff of Kaphamon. An ancient artifact of Neckcrack that languished beneath the dunes for millennia, this staff when unleashed conjures a series of searing bolts to tear into the enemy. From a functional perspective, really all this staff does is it grants Zacharias a bound spell version of Gaze of Nagash. So in Total War Warhammer, I'd have it do the exact same thing, just a limited number of bound spell base Gaze of Nagashes. Next is his armor, for lack of a better word, the Circlet of Rothek. As is the case with most of his items, this unholy object's power originates from ancient Neckcrack. At the center of the cursed circlet is contained a gem that possesses power from the full pantheon that once ruled over the lands of the Tomb Kings. It invokes their protection, which grants Zacharias the Ever-Living an absurdly powerful ward save that makes him incredibly difficult to harm. For Total War Warhammer, this item should take up his armor slot and simply provide him with a powerful ward save as its primary function. Moving forward, the most infamous item possessed by Zacharias is by far the Scrolls of Simtep, which are a series of scrolls that have long formulas of counter magic scrawled upon them in arcane writing. It also originates from, you guessed it, Neckcrack. This item is single-handedly the most overpowered piece of garbage ever unleashed onto tabletop, in my opinion. To make things simple, it allowed the Neckcrack Lord to just automatically cancel an enemy spell once per turn, which is freaking insane in tabletop. In any event, for Total War Warhammer, I would have the item simply take up his enchanted item slot, which I'll explain why in a moment, and it should be an active ability that just nukes the enemy winds of magic in every way. Of all his items, I believe this should be the one that's a quest battle, if any of them of course, just due to the sheer hatred that people possessed for it back in the day. Seriously, this item scarred people's childhoods. Finally, as mentioned earlier, Zacharias has one of the 9 fabled Books of Nagash. This particular book grants him notable magical power, and most famously the ability to cast the most powerful version of Invocation of Nehek ever seen. This spell is hilariously absurd in both size and power compared to the regular versions. So, for in-game, I'd have it grant him a bound spell Overcast Invocation of Nehek, with probably 2 to 3 casts, and of course grant him a buttload of Winds of Magic. Also, this item should be his arcane item, hence why I bumped the scrolls to enchanted to make it that way. Because come on, you can't have a Book of Nagash not be your arcane item. Thankfully, despite the fact we just covered 4 items, it was pretty short because none of Zacharias's have really famous histories, because he just looted them from the tower, and it was like, they're all from Neckcrack, long story short. That being said, let's go ahead and move to his abilities. So, essentially, if there's an ability vampires have related to casting, Zacharias has it. So, Dark Acolyte, Master of the Black Arts, and Loremaster of the Lore Vampires. He also has a rather spooky ability known as Forbidden Lore, which technically would allow him to know any of the common lores of magic except for life, though implementing this seems too difficult and would honestly be a debuff for most vampires because the lore of vampires is just really good. It might be better to take the Forbidden Lore ability back to what it meant when Zacharias was playable, where it simply buffed the Lord in question's casting ability. On top of that, Zacharias also possesses a few other abilities that are exclusive to the Neckcrack bloodline. The first of these is Nehekhara's Noble Blood, which is a particular quirk in Wazoran's bloodline that grants the vampire in question even more magical power than you'd find in any other bloodline, so it just jumps on top of the pile we've already been building. The second ability of note is the Awakening, which essentially made it that when Neckcracks unleashed the Invocation of Nehek, it was more effective than any other vampire at raising corpses. This should be in the game probably just to reduce the casting value of the spell, as making it actually more effective seems like it would be more difficult. So essentially, if you took this upgrade on their skill tree, for instance, the Awakening would just reduce the casting cost for Invocation of Nehek. The final one we'll be looking at is Unholy Cynosure, which as one might expect is yet another buff to casting ability, though this one was notably useful for preventing miscasts rather than buffing your actual cast ability, so perhaps could be a skill that exclusively reduces miscast chance, much like the Slann Mage Priests have the Soul of Stone skill in campaign that reduces their miscasts. For mounts, I would give him just the usual vampire lineup, or the Neckcrack lineup if they get something different. But of course, Zacharias' final mount should be his iconic zombie dragon. As fun fact, he was the only vampire count special character to have a zombie dragon. Manfred didn't get his Dargon until Total War Warhammer, despite randomly using one in a random story that took place in the Badlands. Manfred's strongest option back in the day was only the Abyssal Terror, which we discussed earlier. CA kind of gave him a little nudge and bumped him up to dragon status, as they did with the Red Duke. CA really likes giving characters more powerful mounts than they originally had. For starting location and faction, I'm going to toss a bit of a curveball with this one. Instead of putting him in his traditional hideout within the Empire's Forest of Shadows, I would instead recommend tossing the Neckcrack Lord down somewhere into the Southlands. Seeing as all his artifacts originate from there, and he's obsessed with always increasing his just absurd magical power, it's a very logical step for him to make a field trip down south and rampage around for a bit. As for exactly where in the Southlands, I'm not 100% sure, though I do have a feeling that the best spot for him would honestly be to just plop him just west of Karak Zorn, in that rather uninhabited part of Neckcrack on the Mortal Empires map. It's also rather uninhabited on the Vortex map, but the Vortex map, there's a little more going on there. So he can war against Cetra, Krokkar, and the gang, while also making a likely strong ally with Archon the Black, which, you know, come on, Book of Nagash bros unite. I would quite frankly just put Zacharias in the Neckcrack Brotherhood faction and just have him take it over. They already own that area in the game currently, so essentially the Shifting Sands province. That would work out really nice and require very little work. Just to make sure I'm clear, if you play on the Vortex campaign and you look to your southwest when you're playing Cetra, the Neckcrack Brotherhood kind of starts in that province right next to the mountain range where Karak Zorn and Mount Arachnos are. That's where I'm saying we should put Zacharias. And the exact same thing in the Mortal Empires campaign. Because if you look at the Mortal Empires campaign, you have Cetra, Archon, and then there's there's a few provinces south of them that are just empty of player factions. And it's just kind of a collection of like Tomb Kings, maybe like a human faction, and then the Neckcrack Brotherhood, I believe. So I would just have him take over the Neckcrack Brotherhood and be in just that very, very south area, a little ways west of Karak Zorn. I think that would actually be a really cool starting place for him, and would be a nice, exciting place for the vampire counts to be that would be wildly different than their usual campaign. As for faction effects, I'll spitball the following. For straight-on faction effects for the Neckcrack Brotherhood, I would say give them the ability to inhabit desert terrain as normal terrain. Increase the Winds of Magic power reserve for all Neckcrack Brotherhood armies. And reduce the building cost for the Forbidden Library structure, which, for those of you who might not remember, is the structure that increases your research rate, allows you to recruit necromancers, and also gives you access to things like the Mortis engine. As for Zacharias' Lord effects, I would have him receive a significant cost reduction to his Raise Dead mechanic. I would also have him have increased recruitment rank and upkeep reduction to all ethereal units, and perhaps just have him increase the global research rate for his faction by a good 10 to 20%. Alright, so that concludes the Future of the Vampire Counts series. Thank you all so much for watching. I do want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who has not only liked and commented on each of these videos, but has shared these videos around the spaces that they visit. I also want to give a special shout out to all of my patrons. These guys have supported me through thick and thin, and they make my life not only possible, but survivable. Thank you guys so much for your support. And if you're interested in potentially becoming a patron, consider visiting my Patreon link in the description down below. Even as little as $1 a month helps me out tremendously, because it takes a lot of clicks to just get $1 from YouTube. In any event, this has been enjoyable. I hope you're all looking forward to the next one, which, because you made it to the end of the series, or maybe just this episode, I have a special announcement. We're going to do something a little different to decide who the next Future of series is going to be about. For those of you unaware, I do have an official Twitter account, and I'm trying to kind of build it up and use it more often and yada yada. what we're going to do is to determine which race will have the next Future of series. All you have to do is log on or create a Twitter account, follow me on Twitter at Sotek, and just tweet me which race you want the next Future of series to be about. The only restriction is that the Future of series has to be about the Game 1 races to start. I don't want to even bother with the Game 2 races until we have finished the Game 1 races. So pretty much your options are the Game 1 DLC, which are Bretonnia, the Wood Elves, the Beastmen, Warriors of Chaos, and Norska. Whatever faction you think is the most deserving of a Future of series, or perhaps is just your favorite, let me know on Twitter, and whoever gets the most tweets for their faction is whoever we're going to do next. Once again, thank you all so much for watching. I appreciate everyone who's been participating in the conversation, and hopefully CA will take some of these suggestions into consideration. I will see you next time. Have a great day. Bye.